If you wouldn't mind, I'll just stand down here. I'm 6'8", and if I stand up there, it exacerbates the problem. But gosh, I'm honored that you would think of me. Just a couple of other things about me that might be salient. Being an academic is my second career. My first one was I founded and ran a company with several MIT professors in the Boston area where I live to make a set of products out of advanced materials that they had developed. And the company has become quite successful, but I always had wanted to be a teacher. So as the company hit its stride and I was hitting age 40, my wife said, if you're ever going to do it, buddy, you better do it. And so we put this number two person in charge of the company, and I bailed out, became a doctoral student all over again at age 40 with 5 kids. It was really stupid, looking back on it. But in a lot of ways, I'm glad that I did it in that sequence, because as I left the company to become an academic, I brought a set of questions. And it just turns out that questions are infinitely more valuable than answers. And I think had I not wrestled with these things in building my company, I just wouldn't have thought of them. And one of them is, gosh, I wonder why success is so hard to sustain. And in the businesses, if you look across the sweep of business history, most companies, which at one point were widely regarded as unassailably successful, a decade or two later, they're in the middle of the pack and often at the bottom of the heap. And why is success so hard to sustain? And then another one was, I wonder why innovation is so darned hard. I'll just frame it. It's for you as the way I framed it. And that is, venture capital attracts some of the smartest people in this generation. And these guys will get hundreds of business plans every year that they want to, who think they have a good idea. And so the venture capitalists have to flip through and then throw away 95% of them. But the 5% are ones which, in their wisdom, they think merit special attention. And so they'll study them more deeply. If it still holds water, they will then bring in consultants who are experts in the technology or in the markets and ask them to just study it from their perspective of technology or market interest. And if they put holy water on it, then they'll try to do different scenarios of the future. And after all of this, they'll come just the few that they're going to put money in. And when they put their money in, man, they're certain that this one is going to succeed. And then in the end, only 15% of them succeed. 85% fail. Is this a little bit scary? That some of the smartest people you can find go through all of that and with certainty are right only 15% of the time. And this was the puzzle. Is innovation truly a crapshoot that is unpredictable, intrinsically unpredictable? And the conclusion that I reached on both of these questions of why is success so hard to sustain and why is innovation apparently unpredictable, the root cause was the practices of good management that we teach at the Harvard Business School. And if they do everything that we say they should do, this will cause them to fail, and that they will be ineffective as innovators. In other words, the problem is us. So then I've been trying to figure out how do you solve that problem. And so it's been kind of fun. What I thought I would do is just ask you for just a few minutes to suspend your disbelief on what I'm going to say. And then I'll try to explain why do I want to start this lecture about steel. One other thing I should have mentioned, I had a stroke about last year. A clot came from somewhere and lodged itself right there in my brain where I formulate speech. And I was giving a talk at MIT, and all of a sudden, I just couldn't talk. And it killed that part of my brain. And so I went to the airport in Boston and got my copy of Rosetta Stone for English and just started at level 1, lesson 1, and I've been trying to learn how to speak again one word at a time. And so you'll see me or hear me say the wrong word, or I can't come up with the word, and if you know the word that I'm looking for, just let me know so we don't waste your time. But you'll also see that I've developed this strange proclivity to look at the floor rather than you. And the reason is that if I look at you, you will distract me. And if I look at the floor, I can concentrate on what the word is. So it's not that I suddenly became shy. That it's just the way my brain will work. Anyway, this is around a question of why is success so hard to sustain? And I think that I don't imagine a lot of you guys have made a lot of steel yet in your lives. And in one way, it has nothing to do with the future of education, but in other ways, it says everything about the future of education. So historically, most of the world's steel has been made, as in the upper left, in massive integrated mills. Whoops. I'm sorry. Can you help me with? I'm okay. It would take today about $10 billion to build a new integrated steel mill. The other way to do it, as I've depicted here, is in what they call a mini mill. And a mini mill melts scrap in electric furnaces. And you could put easily 20 electric furnaces in this room. Because you can make steel in such a small chamber, they don't have to scale up the downstream steps, and that's why they call these things mini mills. The most important dimension of a mini mill is that you can make steel of any given quality in a mini mill for 20% lower cost than you can make it in an integrated mill. So just think about this for a minute. Imagine that you were the CEO of a steel company somewhere in the world. In a really good year, your profit as a percent of revenue will be 4 to 5%. Here is a new technology, mini mills, that would reduce the full cost of making steel by 20%. Don't you think you'd adopt this new technology? And yet not a single integrated steel company anywhere in the world has yet built and operated a mini mill. And this is why something that makes consummate sense is impossible for smart people to do. So the steel industry, like every industry, is tiered. So at the bottom of the market is concrete reinforcing bar or rebar. Almost all of us could make rebar. At the top of the market is sheet steel that is used to make appliances and cars. It is very hard to make that stuff. And at the beginning of this story, the integrated mills made the full range of these products. The mini mill technology became technologically viable in the late 1960s. And because they were melting scrap in these electric furnaces, the quality that they could make was truly crummy. And in fact, the only market that would buy what the mini mills made was the rebar market down at the bottom, because there are almost no specifications for rebar anyway. And then once you buried it in cement, you couldn't verify whether it had met spec or not. And so it was a perfect market for crummy products. As the mini mills attacked that tier of the market, the reaction of the integrated mills on the left was, They were just relieved to get out of the rebar business because it truly was a dog-eat-dog commodity. Their gross margins were only 7%. And it just didn't make sense to try to defend the rebar position when if they focused their assets on the angle iron and thicker bar and rod, they could generate 12% margins. And so as the mini mills expanded their capacity, the integrated mills just shut those lines down. And an interesting thing then happened. As the integrated mills lopped off the lowest profit part of the product line and added up the remaining numbers, their profitability improved as they got out. The mini mills, because they had a 20% cost advantage, they made tons of money as they got in. So they're quite happy with each other. And they were quite happy with it until 1979. That was the year when the mini mills finally succeeded in driving the last high-cost integrated player out of the rebar market. If you look at what happened to the price of rebar in 1979, the price collapsed by 20%. And it turns out that there's just a subtle fact about strategy that nobody thought about before. And that is a low-cost strategy only works when you have a high-cost competitor in the market. And as soon as they had fled out of rebar, then it was just low-cost mini-mill fighting against low-cost mini-mill in a commodity business. And very quickly, competition drove prices down to the point where nobody could make money. So what are these mini-mills going to do? Well, for a while, they just tried to be more efficient making rebar, but that was just a recipe for survival. And then one of them looked up market and realized, oh my gosh, if we just make bigger and better steel, we'd make money again. And as they attacked angle iron and thicker bar and rod, the reaction to the integrated mills was, man, they were happy to get out of that business. It was such a dog-eat-dog commodity. And why would they ever want to defend a 12% margin business when they had the option to focus their assets in structural steel where the margins are truly interesting? And so the very same thing happened as the mini mills lopped off the lowest profit part of their product line and added up the remaining numbers. Their profitability improved as they got out. The mini mills, as they got in, they had a 20% cost advantage again. And so their profitability improved. Felt good to get out, good to get in. And things stayed together until 1984. That was the year when the mini mills finally succeeded in driving the last high-cost integrated player out of that tier of the business. What happened to the price of angle iron and bar and rod in 1984? The price collapsed by 20%. And the reward to the mini mills for their victory is they couldn't make any money. So what are those poor suckers going to do? They got to move up. And they really just stretched angle iron into the smallest I-beams and H-beams that undergird mobile homes and things like that. And as they hit the low end of that market, the reaction of the integrated mills was, man, they were happy to get out of that business because it was such a dog-eat-dog commodity. It almost like I told you this before, but the very same thing happened as the integrated mills lopped off the lowest profit part of the product line, added up the remaining numbers, their profitability improved as they got out of the low end. As the mini mills got into the high end for them, their profitability improved. And things were put together until 1996. That was the year when the mini mills finally succeeded in driving the last high-cost integrated player, Bethlehem, out of the structural steel business. If you look at what happened to the price of structural beams that year, collapsed by 20%. And what are these poor mini mills going to do? They got to figure out how to make structural steel in the mini mill. And as they hit the low end of that market, the reaction, it looks like this is moving twice rather than once. So the mini mills got out of the commodity sheet to move up in specialty steels. And today, about 65% of North America's steel is made in mini mills. All but one of the integrated mills has gone bankrupt. So you notice I was able to tell the whole story without using the word stupid manager once, because there was no stupidity involved on either side of the equation. Every time the integrated mills got out of the low end of their market, their profitability improved. And every time the mini mills got into the high end of their market, their profitability improved. And if you're a little boy, you want to kill a giant. If you think that you can kill a giant by leaping ahead of them on the integrated mill's trajectory to make better products that you can sell for better profits to their best customers, the giant is just going to kill you. But if, as a little boy, you come underneath them and pick up a piece of real estate where the giant is actually motivated to flee rather than fight you, this is the mechanism by which success is so hard to sustain. It's somebody comes in underneath you. Now, can you think of other industries around the world where this same thing has occurred? Somebody comes in at the bottom of the market and then cleans it out. Somebody said autos. Yeah, I don't know if you remember, there's a company called Toyota around. And they did not enter the American car market with Lexuses. They came out in the 1960s with a rusty little subcompact called a Corona. And then they went from a Corona to Tercel, Corolla, Camry, Avalon, 4Runner, Sequoia, and then a Lexus. And General Motors and Ford were up there on the integrated steel business, making big cars for big people. And they'd look down there and see Toyota coming up after them, and they'd say, you know, we ought to go get those buggers. And they'd send down a Chevette or a Pinto. But then they would compare the profitability of these little subcompacts with the profitability of making even bigger SUVs and even bigger pickup trucks for even bigger people. It made no sense to defend the least profitable part of the business when they had the option of investing up there. And now it's clear that they should, 30 years ago, have been worried about this stuff. But essentially, this process that we call disruption, where somebody comes in at the bottom of the market and moves up, has essentially finished Detroit off. Who's killing Toyota? They do not feel as if they're being killed, incidentally. Yeah, the Korea and Hyundai, the Koreans, and they've taken the low end of the market away from Toyota. Not because Toyota's asleep at the switch, but why would they ever want to defend the least profitable part of the business when they have the privilege of competing against Mercedes in luxury cars? And then another company called Chery is coming from China. And seriously, nobody has to worry about those guys. I had a student who returned to Japan a number of years ago and took a job in their Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And the guy was sentenced to develop a plan for the resurrection of Japan's economy. This is a very interesting problem, isn't it? Because through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Japan's economy was growing at unprecedented rates. And all of a sudden, around 1990, Japan's economy just died. And it's been for 20 years in a stagnant swamp. So my student worked on this problem for a couple of years, and he called me up one day, and he said, Clay, there's no hope for Japan. And I'm a very optimistic guy. And so I said, look, why don't you come back to Harvard? We'll work on it for a couple of days and solve Japan's problem. And so he came over, and after about an hour, he convinced me that there is indeed no hope for Japan. And what he pointed out is that every one of the companies that constituted the fundamental engine of Japan's macroeconomic growth did this. Toyota did it in cars. Honda started first in motorcycles and then moved into cars. RCA did it got killed by Sony. Canon did it to Xerox. Seiko did it to our watch industry, and Mitsui did it in ship making. And by 1990, every one of those companies had become the manufacturers of the best products in their categories in the world. And the great thing about the high end is that the margins, percentage margins, are really attractive, but the volumes up there are not. And their economy just died. And he pointed out that the reason why there's no hope for Japan is as Japan disrupted America's manufacturing core, the manufacturing companies just had to consolidate, laid off people, went broke, and consolidated more. But some of the people, as they left the big companies, got venture capital and started new ways of growth in new industries. And so our economy kept growing, even though manufacturing essentially got disrupted by Japan. And he pointed out that in Japan, they don't have labor market mobility or venture capital to speak of. And so Japan played the game once, and it's finished. There's no hope. And he pointed out that Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong disrupted Japan, starting at the simple end of the market. And boy, do you notice how Hyundai is racing up market, screeching for the top, and they're actually perilously close to the top now. And here come China and India coming from the bottom. So there really are microeconomic roots to companies' macroeconomic prosperity. Well, part of my course at the Harvard Business School is we look at phenomena in industries or companies through the lens of a theory like this. And this is what we would call a theory of causality. What causes this to happen is the pursuit of profit. And so we try to put on, and we call this a theory of disruption, put it on like a set of lenses and examine another company or another industry to see, can we understand why this company got in trouble and then what to do about it? And I ask the students every class to come to class having studied the theory, this one or others, and I want you to come to tell Clay what's wrong with the theory, what it doesn't explain, because a good theory can only get better if people figure out what it doesn't explain. And so about 5 years ago, a student came in and said, Clay, this doesn't happen in hotels. And oh my gosh, he was right. It doesn't happen in hotels. And it took me about 5 years to figure out what was going on. And the insight we got is that in the industries where this has happened, and if we had 3 hours, we could talk about industry after industry where the leaders got killed by this. But in those industries, there was what you might call a technological core that was extendable up market. And so the chemistry that was capable in the mini mill at the beginning was only good enough to make rebar, but their control of the chemistry in the melt got so good that it was extendable up market so that you could make sheet. When Michael Dell fabricated or slapped together his first personal computers in his dorm room, all he could make was the simplest of computers. But the core was a microprocessor, and it was extendable up market. And so Dell could go from there all the way up to making the best servers in the world now. But I realized that there was not a technological core in hotels. So Holiday Inn came into the low end of the market, and for reasons we can understand, the high-priced hotels didn't come down to compete against Holiday Inn, but Holiday Inn couldn't go up market. And McDonald's came in at the bottom of the market, and for reasons we understand, the high-priced restaurants didn't compete against McDonald's, but McDonald's has not been able to move up market. And we realized that the reason is there's just not a technological core. And so if Holiday Inn wants to move to higher price points, they can do it, but as they do it, they have to replicate the business model of the competitors that they're trying to emulate. They can't disrupt them with a lower cost business model. They have to emulate them. And so if I want to move up, I have to hire a concierge, just like the Four Seasons has to hire a concierge. They replicate rather than disrupt. And this then was very helpful for me in looking at the future of higher ed. Because in higher education, historically, there has not been a technological core that would enable somebody who came in at the higher education equivalent of the low end and then move up market. And so I was raised in Utah. There was a university that is there in Ogden called Weber State. And they come in as a 2-year junior college, we used to call them, and they want to become a better school. And so they move from a 2 to a 4-year school, and then they want to go into master's degrees, and then they want to go into become a research university. And as they try to emulate, as go up market, to do that, they had to emulate the other universities that they wanted to be like. And then as the University of Utah tried to become truly a world-famous engineering school, they had to replicate the cost position of MIT. And so there has been a lot of moving up market, as you know, but there has been no disruption because in order to move up, they've had to emulate the company's cost structure that they're trying to be like. But online learning now brings to higher ed a technological core that is now extendable up market. And so just like the mini mills, online learning can begin doing the simplest of the things that, oh my gosh, online learning is getting better and better and better so that you can see it beginning. Never did the mini mills become better than the integrated mills. And that's always the case. But that's the right answer to the wrong question. And the question is, will it become good enough with what customers in various tiers of the market need? And I'll just describe something that happened to me. So about 8 months ago, I was just in my office doing my business, and I got a call from the University of Phoenix, the dean of their business school. And the University of Phoenix, as you know, is largely an online institution. And he said, "Clay, we've read your junk. We've watched you. We'd like to record your 10 best lectures to show to our students." So I went to the dean and asked if this would be okay. He was incredulous that I would consider it. And he said, "It's not that I worry about Harvard. I mean, we don't compete against those guys, but what about your brand, Clay? Isn't going to prostitute your brand?" And I said, "I have no brand, but I do know that based on my studies, what's going on at the low end today is likely to be the mainstream tomorrow, and I'd like to just understand how these guys do their work. And he said, well, go ahead if you want to. So turns out Harvard won't allow them to record a class in our halls, and said that's fine. So they went downtown and rented the auditorium in the Institute for Contemporary Art, a beautiful place. If I'm walking you, behind me was a massive bay window. You could see the entire Boston Harbor from this. And then they said, you know, we'll bring about 40 students on, just 40 students, so that you don't have to teach to an empty room. Anyway, so I show up 5 minutes before we're supposed to start. And I'm putting the PowerPoint on their computer, and I looked up at the students. Holy cow. These were beautiful people. Truly beautiful. And I went up and asked one of them, what school do you guys go to? And he said, oh, we're not students, we're models. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I know they've watched me do my stuff. Regularly, Clay gets boring. And when Clay goes down, we need to pan the audience who are being paid to pretend that they're interested, you know? Anyway, so I understand, and I did my best. Anyway, about a month later, the dean called me up and he said, by the way, have you ever seen Clayton Christensen teach? And I said, actually, no. How is he? And he said, well, watch for yourself. I am not kidding you. Clay Christensen is unbelievable. I have never listened to any professor who is so cogent, meaning not a single word was lost. Everything just fit together. And it wasn't boring stuff like this. Clay's presentation was three-dimensional, active. It even had music in the background. And as the mini mills got into the sheet steel business, the music came to a crescendo, you know. I am not kidding you. If you ever want to know how Clay Christensen is, watch this. So I asked him, geez, well, how many of your students are you going to show this to? And I said, well, right now we're thinking that we'll show it to all 135,000 of our full-time MBA students. And I said, oh. I thought Harvard was, I think we're the second biggest in business, aren't we? We bring in 900 a year. And he said, I know. There's a concept in business that I think has kind of dropped out of your consciousness. It's called scale. Have you ever heard of it? And oh my gosh, the Harvard Business School, you might not have noticed this, but we have resources, right? An endowment. But 135,000 students, this is what you call resources. And they spend $350 million a year making their curriculum better. In contrast, Harvard spends $0 every year making its teaching better. We spend a lot on research, but this thing that teaching, you know, is just not what we do. And all of a sudden, I just realized that this technological core that has come into higher ed, the fact that in our past, higher disruption was never been disrupted, in fact, was never happened. But in the future, I worry about it a lot. Now, just another piece from our research. So you can diagram the history of almost all industries through a lens of this diagram where I've got concentric circles. And the one in the middle represents customers who have the most money, and the most skill. And then as you go to the larger circles, they represent larger populations of people who don't have as much money or as much skill. Almost always, the industries begin at the beginning, in the center, because the first manifestations of the product are so complicated and expensive that only the rich have access. And so if you go back in the history of computing, the first manifestation of digital computing was what we called the mainframe. These are massive machines that filled a whole room. They cost $2 million. So only the largest universities and the largest corporations could have one. Then the personal computer emerged, and that reduced the cost from $2 million to $2,000. And plain old folks like you and I have then access to it. And then the smartphone made computing so much simpler and more affordable that everybody can just take computing with them in their pockets, not just in America, but around the world. And almost every industry where something that started out as inaccessible and very expensive, that became affordable and accessible, went through this process. And in the process, the market grew remarkably by making it affordable and simple. Interestingly, the people in the middle never were the leaders in moving out because of disruption. So I want to just go through one other history to help you illustrate why this happens the way it does, and then we can look at the lens, through this lens, at higher ed again. So one of the most important examples of disruption in history was the disruption of the vacuum tube by the transistor in the 50s and 60s. And it takes a little bit of gray hair here to remember this, but prior to about 1965, almost all consumer electronics products like televisions and radios were made with a technology called vacuum tubes, and they were the size of a child's fist. And a TV had about 20 of these in it, and so the television was bigger than this podium here. It had to sit on the ground. In today's money, it cost $3,000 to $4,000. So only the rich could have one of these things, and they generated a lot of heat. The transistor was disruptive because it couldn't handle the power required to be used in making these massive televisions, and the radios sat on the credenza in your dining room. Every one of the vacuum tube companies, and these are the giants of the industry at the time, RCA, Zenith, Westinghouse, General Motors, they took a license to the transistor, but they framed it as a technological problem. In other words, the new technology can't handle the power to be used in the market. And so they took the license into their labs and tried to make the technology good enough that it could be used in the market. And in today's money, they spend about $3 billion trying to make transistors good enough to be used in the market. While they were working on this problem, out here, and I'm using the words competing against non-consumption, meaning innovators came out in this direction with disruptive applications that made televisions and radios so simple that a whole new population of people could now buy one. And that's what I mean by competing against non-consumption. So the first application was the hearing aid in 1951. It was an application where you couldn't actually make that with vacuum tubes. And then in 1955, Sony introduced the world's first pocket radio. And I hate to ask this question of you, Warren, but do you remember those things? They were crummy, you know. But Sony sold its pocket radio. It cost $2, fit right in your pocket. It had a tinny sound, static laced, but they sold it to the rebar of humanity, people that we call teenagers today. And it allowed teenagers to do something that was never possible before, and that is to listen to rock and roll outside of the earshot of their mothers. And they were delighted with the crummy product because it was infinitely better than nothing. Had they tried to sell that to my parents, it would have been judged as a crummy product because relative to the RCA, it truly was crummy. And my brother and I grew up in Salt Lake, we bought one, and we had to face west to the Great Salt Lake in order to get reception. But again, we were thrilled with this. And then in 1959, Sony introduced the world's first portable television. And those of you who remember that, these were very limited things. But by making it so much more affordable and accessible, a whole new population of people now had access to it because it was infinitely better than nothing. They were delighted to have these Sony televisions. And so here in the green, a massive new market emerged in solid state, and the RCA and its compatriots felt no pain because these are all new companies, or all new customers. But as in the green space, that market grew and grew and grew, the technology got better and better and better until the mid to the late 1960s, you could start to use solid state to make big things with it. And within about 5 years, you just heard this sucking sound as the customers were sucked out of the core in the blue space into the green, and every one of the vacuum tube companies evaporated. And it's a very sad story because the technology was with the blue people. And they were not asleep at the switch. They saw the technology coming much sooner than Sony did. It's not that they weren't committed to it. RCA itself spent 30 times more money trying to make solid state electronically work in their market than Sony ever spent on the technology. But the only way that it would work in the blue space is if this new technology performed better and was more cost-effective than the old technology. It had to be better than what was there in order to supplant it. But by Sony coming out here and competing against non-consumption, all they had to do was make a product that was better than nothing. The customers were thrilled, and then the technology, little by little, got better and better until it sucked the customers from the back into the front, and they all got killed. Now you notice on the top of the upper left, the vertical axis, I put that the metric of performance changes. Almost always that's the case. And the people in the middle have a tendency to disparage the new approach because it's not as good as the old in the way that they define goodness. And so if you think about how you defined a personal computer on your desktop versus how do we define a smartphone, it's just a different metric of goodness. And in higher education, I think at least for Harvard, in the blue, the way we define performance is defined by the faculty. Do our faculty go to good schools? Do they publish good stuff? And the better resumes we have, the higher we go on the ranking. We measure the number of students per faculty. We won't adjust that for what proportion of the faculty are actually spent teaching, of course. Out here, the online learners, such as University of Phoenix, they have an arcane measure of performance called teaching. and invest massively in this new technology. So turns out, I think, I'm not a missionary for the University of Phoenix. There are a lot of them like that. So Laureate, Kaplan, and you know who they are. Their average student is 36 years old. They're competing against non-consumption. These folks, 3 kids, a job. The last thing in the world I want to do is to have to go onto some campus somewhere to take a course so that I can get a better job. We might measure, those of us in the blue come out here and say, it's not as good because their graduation rate isn't as good. Generally, for these people, that's irrelevant. They want a job, or I want a better job. And for them, if I can get the courses that I need, that's what they need. And so we measure them by the wrong measure. Almost always it is the case that the customers are sucked out of the back into the front. It's rare that the technology is sucked from the front into the back. And as the customers leave, then those guys just implode. Now, so I wanted just to scare the pants off of us. Because if history is any guide, and I think we see this happening just right in front of our eyes, and yet we don't see that it really is, what do we do about it? Well, almost always, the new technology has to be deployed in undemanding applications. So if the mini mills had tried to go after sheet at the beginning, they'd have been killed. So they take the simple application and then they improve it. And in higher education, they go after customers who actually don't want to go to the campus because of their situation. And so let's just think about electric cars as a disruptive technology. If you want to make that electric car to go in head-on competition in the California freeway, which is the most demanding market known to mankind, you'll have to call that thing a Tesla. And it costs $100,000. So it's just a curiosity. If you really want to make it serious, you have to put it in an undemanding application. And the question that you want to ask on this one is there a customer out there who would just love to have a car that won't go very far or go very fast? The parents of teenagers. Seriously, they would love to have a car, the parents, that won't go far or go fast. And we need to be able to buy it with a MasterCard. And so they can just have this to tool around, go to school, see their friends, come home at night, plug it in. But then the technology gets better and better, and when mine is at the shop, I tell my teenager, I got your car today, you know. And it'll get better and better in that way. If you, that's the reason it's not that I don't like Tesla, it's just as kind of a, but if you want to have the new technology to be deployed in the main market, it has to be a hybrid. And in the history of disruption, always, if you try to deploy the new technology in the mainstream market, the only way it works is if it takes the best of the old and the best of the new. And so I suspect that Harvard and USC are in the blue. The way we deal with this is a hybrid. And so one reason why they come to our schools is they want this campus experience. They want to grow up to become adults, not underneath the thumb of my mother. And there's a lot of things that is really important about learning that you get only in the on-campus environment. And so more and more of the delivery of the content is done online, but we still have it on the campus. If history is any guide, though, the online campus experience also gets disrupted. And so we could, because they're modular, we could teach the academics could be done online. And then how you grow up, we could join the Peace Corps for 2 years or go to Habitat for Humanity for 6 months. There are actually a lot of things that compete with the on-campus experience. So we actually are not safe from disruption on either side. And I think that most universities, I'm going to come next into a concept of modularity, but the delivery of the academic program and the on-campus experience in the minds of most of the faculty are modular. The academic part, this is why we're here, and I hope somebody's worrying about what they do on campus, but I'm certainly not. And so they're modular, and because of that, they could independently get picked off by competing disruptions. So to back up, I gave a talk about this in an earlier stage of my thinking at Bowdoin College in Maine. It's a lovely college. And as I was at dinner, and the trustees were the ones who were there, the president said, "You see her? She and her husband just gave us $44 million. And interestingly, her connection isn't to Bowdoin, but it's to an English professor who just changed her life." And then he said, "You see him? He just gave us $18 million, and his connection is not to Bowdoin, but of all people, the hockey coach who just changed his life." And he went through at the members of the Board of Trustees that have been so generous to the school, and literally in every case, the connection to the school was a relationship with an individual member of the faculty who changed their life. Oddly, none of the math that they learned constituted this same connection. It was a personal relationship. So I thought about this a lot as I then come back to the Harvard Business School. And for a lot of reasons, I attend all of our reunions. And every 5 years, we bring the alumni back. They think we want them back because we want the connection, intellectual. Really, we want their money, right? But anyway, so I go. And I just try to listen to how they banter back and forth about the experiences at the Harvard Business School that they remember. And there are about 8 of our faculty who come up over and over again in these discussions. And you look back at then, who are these people who remember these professors? And then you look at how much money they give to the school. And I think that these 8 professors generate about 80% of all of the philanthropy that is given our way. And it's really interesting that the faculty never says thanks to these folks. And when we interview the new generation of the faculty, never does the question come up, is this a person who in her heart is coming into academia because she wants to change the lives of the students. What we look at is she a good researcher? Has she published anything yet? Occasionally, I wonder if she's going to be a good teacher. But we measure the metric that is, I think, largely irrelevant to the future. And I think that if we want to negotiate what's ahead, rather having our faculty say, we're here to do research, they make us teach, and I hope somebody's taken care of the online or on-campus experience. We need people who integrate these things all on the same page. And they view what they're here in a holistic way. Because when a traditional competitor integrates these things, it's actually quite hard for disruptors to displace them from the core. And I've been thinking about that, and I just wanted to use that one. So this next one relates to cost. And when I've raised issues with folks in my part of the world about, are we worried about online learning? And I will say it's lower cost. The response is it's not. The University of Phoenix tuition is roughly within 5% what your tuition is. I haven't looked, but I suspect that that's what it will show. Interestingly, if you look at the cost rather than the price, there's a huge difference. Like Laureate, which I think is the second largest of the online schools, and their revenues are about $7 billion a year. You have revenue here, and then you have all of their costs here, and then below that is what they call profit. Profit is 40% of revenue. They are much lower in cost. And why this is salient will come up from this one. So my sense is that the government has played a role of putting a floor under tuition. Not a ceiling, but the floor. And the floor is what we would call, in the real world, hydraulic jacks. And so I just got photos here, but let's just think about the competition between you and Stanford. I don't know if that's salient or not. But you guys have never competed on price. The way you compete is you'll build a new building. And the guys in Palo Alto will say, I'll be darned if they're going to have better facilities than us. And so they make a better building, and you see, well, we got to add this program. And they got to say, they're not going to beat us. And they add this, and they bring the Harvard Business School just this year, in January, we announced to our first year, you guys, you don't have to come to class. What we're going to do is we're going to send you all around the world. You can visit 4 nations just to get the better sense of what the world is about, you know. And, oh yeah, it's going to cost $20,000, but you can go into debt. And here's the way you can go into debt, and we'll show them that. And so we don't ever have to compete on price. We compete on being better and better and better. And we really are in an arms race with our competitors, trying to get the best faculty, the best students, the best resources, so that we're the best. And what's going to happen as we keep adding more stuff is, thank goodness, we have Pell Grants and loans, and so we don't have to worry about controlling our costs. We just say, well, tuition next year is this. And then they pay for it. Well, it turns out that in America, there's about $1 trillion of student loans outstanding. Half of them likely will never get repaid. I don't know if you remember this thing that was called a mortgage crisis a couple of years ago. This is of that magnitude. And I hate to say bad things about us, but the actors in the mortgage crisis were these people who originated the mortgages. Because all they had to do is just grab you and convince you that you would be richer if you bought a second home. And I actually don't even want to know what your finances look like. But just fill this out, sign here. I will get a fee for originating the loan, and then we will sell that into a pool of mortgages. And those guys, if you don't pay your loan, they're holding the revenue, the asset that is worth nothing, and they'll go bankrupt and so on. But the originator, I got my fee, and the more mortgages we can originate, the more money I make. And these were bad actors, nice people, but So who are the originators of this crisis here? Ladies and gentlemen, it's us. So we'll keep adding more and more programs here, and our students have to go deeper and deeper into debt. And so they'll call up and say, all right, we've arranged from 4 different sources the funding for my freshman year. And then we say, oh, I forgot to tell you just one thing. Before you come to class, you need to pay tuition for the first semester. And they say, okay, and so we get the money, and then the minute that we get the money, it gets sold off into a pool, and they may go bankrupt, they may not, who cares, but we got the money. And I don't mean to say bad things about us, but we are essentially originating these loans, and we get the fee, and somebody pays the cost. And so it's just inconceivable to me that the government continue to put the hydraulic pressure into these jacks, given where we are. And sometime over the next 10 years, I just got to think that they will never say in Washington, we can't do this anymore. But the system will say to them, this cannot persist. Because in the process at the state level and at the government, Washington level, healthcare goes in and takes its own. And what's left over, then the legislatures think about, should we give this to K through 12? Should we give this to higher ed? And I think higher ed comes down the pike somewhere. And I think you feel that already in Sacramento. And when that happens, and the jacks give way, then I think price competition starts. And when that happens, then people that we call the online schools all of a sudden can bring tuition down by 40%. And for you and for us, boy, it's real hard to take 40% of our cost out. And so I worry about this. I don't mean to ruin a nice evening, but so just more stuff that I'm thinking about. So there's a concept in our research that relates to the characteristic of product design. And this is kind of, I'm trying to replicate the mini mill story where the the dashed lines represent the ability of customers to use improvement. And then the more steep lines are the ability of competitors to improve their products. And almost always, this the rate at which products improve is faster than the ability of customers to use the improvement. That's why the mini mills could start just making rebar and then get good enough that they could make sheet. Almost always that's the case. Now, at the beginning of the industry, almost always when the products are not good enough for what customers need, the architecture has to be proprietary and interdependent, meaning, as I described there with the puzzle pieces, the design of any piece depends upon the design of all of the other pieces. And because of that interdependence, to play in the game, you have to do everything in order to do anything. If you try, instead of having a proprietary interdependent architecture, to have a modular architecture that is an open standard where the components fit together in standard ways, defining the standards takes so many degrees of freedom away from the engineers that they have to walk off from the frontier of what's possible. And so we would all remember this. Do you remember when online music first became plausible in the early 90s? So we bought the player from a company from Singapore called Creative, and then you downloaded stuff from Napster or Kazaa, and you had to be a teenager really to do this thing. Our generation, just didn't do it. But it was clunky and it was modular. The pieces came from various sources and they had to fit together, and they didn't fit together very well. And then Apple came to the rescue with a proprietary, optimized, interdependent system from beginning to end. And for the rest of us, it was just relief. Do you remember how much better they were? But then as the technology gets better and better and better, it becomes more than good enough for what the customers down here need. And when that happens, the way you compete changes. And the architecture, the way you compete is you're fast and flexible and responsive. And to be competed in this way, the primary architecture becomes modular, where the pieces fit together. And your Dell computer is like this. The pieces all just together. And this is a very regular phenomenon. So with the cell phone world now, the ones that are the winners, the first winner was the RIM BlackBerry, and it was the most interdependent. And boy, it had a great ride, and now they're kind of dying off. The next proprietary one is not as proprietary as RIM, is Apple. But then you see coming down at the bottom, the Android operating system that makes these smartphones modular. And modularity means that there are 2,000 companies in China that are going and they cost half the cost of the Apple iPhone. And so the folks up in Cupertino are feeling pretty good about themselves, and they should, because their strategy was temporarily the right strategy. But now open modular is going to change the world on them. And I made a deal, if they will pray for the Harvard Business School, I will pray for them. Now, I guess one other thing, and then I come to higher ed. In the upper left, where the money is made is by the people that stick it all together in this proprietary way. So when computers were up there, IBM had a 70% market share. They made 95% of the industry's profit. When automobiles were up there, General Motors had a 55% market share. They made 80% of the industry's profit. If you were a supplier of components to IBM or General Motors, you lived a miserable, profit-free existence year after year. But over here, where the money flips. And so if you're Dell and you're just snapping these things together, you can't compete everybody can snap them together. Where the money is made is the components, like Intel Inside, NVIDIA's graphics processor, Windows operating system, because what drives its performance isn't, you can't change the way it snaps together. You can't differentiate that. It's the components where you make the money. So I wrote a piece on this called Skate to Where the Money Will Be, in honor of Wayne Gretzky. Remember when he was working for you here? And somebody asked him, how come you're so good? And he said, I never go to where the money is, where the puck is. We always go to where the puck will be. And that's just kind of where the money is made now isn't where we want to go for the future. And so what does modularity mean to higher ed? So just imagine that we're going to start Clayton Christensen University. Bad name, but whatever. If I want to build a traditional university, the architecture of academia is interdependent. So if I want to change electrical engineering 311, I actually can't do it unless we change electrical engineering 211, because it's a prerequisite. And I can't say what 311 stands for. There's no standard of competencies or understanding that you got to have at the end of 311, because what you know depends on all of the prerequisites as well as what they do in 411, you know? And as a consequence, you can't accreditate a course. You have to accredit the whole thing. And you have to do everything in order to do anything. And to try to figure out what's this, like, come to kind of standards of competencies or understanding of a course. You may know that we've been thinking about this for quite a long time. And in fact, we'll still be arguing about these questions after the second coming. Because there's no answer to those in an interdependent world. So if I want to create a new college in a traditional way, this is a very difficult hurdle to overcome. But if I just look in the other direction and say, we want to have Clay Christensen University to be a modular school. In one of our first meetings, somebody says, well, who should we hire to teach the introductory course in physics? We go with a few names, you know, whose names are not known by anybody. And then Clay says, do you know there's this guy at MIT, his name is Richard Lewin, just a world-class known physicist, known by everyone. He actually has an introductory course that he offers online. 5 million students have taken the course. And somebody says, well, is it a good course? And I say, if Richard Lewin says it's a good course, it's a good course. And somebody says, well, what's the standards? Like, what do the students have to show to you know what I'm trying to say. And I said, well, if enough people are asking if they can take Richard's course, I think whatever he says the course is about is what the course is about. And the more people who have their students take his introductory physics course, little by little, inadvertently, a standard emerges. And we didn't have to negotiate with our competitors about what's the standard. The market just happens. And then somebody says, now, who are we going to hire to do accounting? And I say, actually, there's this guy at BYU named Norm Nemro. He's got the first 4 courses of accounting online. I hate to say this, it is so good that the Harvard Business School doesn't teach accounting anymore, because this guy beats the pants off of any of our faculty. And our faculty were quite happy to give away the introductory courses, because our faculty are doing research up with all these esoteric things, you know. And then I think you get what I'm saying. And so we have a different type of university that is modular. And oh yeah, Clay hasn't yet hired a member of the faculty. But oh, by the way, the people who are teaching our courses happen to be the best teachers in the world. And they were not accessible to just a few people. Now all of our students have access to the best. And somebody says, well, what do your overheads look like? And I said, oh, I never thought about overheads before. But actually, they're really insignificant here. And the last time I was driving, my family, some of them still live in Salt Lake City. The last time I drove from Salt Lake to Provo was about 40 miles. I saw 4 new universities that I hadn't seen before. And these are names of universities on the face of an office building. And their faculty aren't there. But boy, are they great teachers. And I worry about this. But I think the big deal, at least for the Harvard Business School, and I think for you guys, is where the money is made shifts. So on the right-hand side, if you're just assembling the courses, we are the equivalent of Dell Computer. And the money and the brand is on the course, not on the university. The university actually becomes, you don't really care if your computer is from Dell or Hewlett-Packard or Lenovo or Acer, right? What matters is the components inside. I suspect that will be the case, and that the unit of accreditation will be the course, not the university. And so it actually almost becomes irrelevant whether I give degrees or not. What really matters is if I delivered the courses. And there's another dimension of it, which is, how do I say this? God didn't reveal from heaven that the right place to line the line between education and professional life is 4 years. You know, I suspect that that's just arbitrarily somebody said, why don't we just go that far and then spike the ball and walk off the field? And I think what these guys are doing is they'll go to Walmart and they'll say, now, what kind of folks do you need for this function or that function? And working with them, I come back, thank goodness it's modular, and I will put together a program for what the employer needs. And then I go for a high-tech company or a new startup in entertainment, and we figure out that the end of what we call the end line is they have the skills and a great job, as opposed to we just, anyway, I've been thinking about this stuff. Let's see. Are you doing all right? We're supposed to end in 5 minutes, aren't we? Okay. This is a great concept, but that's okay. Questions, comments, criticisms, cannonballs? Yes.
I love your idea of modular, but may I ask a question that might challenge it a little bit?
No, you can't.
Okay, here, you take this back.
I'm the professor.
Okay, so I come from just the learner's perspective. And are you saying then that there's no longer a brand in the degree learning objective? It's merely going to be student learning objectives per course?
Well, so I don't have an opinion, but the theory has an opinion on this, okay? And so what the theory would say is all of these disruptions happen at the bottom of the market. So in simple applications, amongst people who are not, in this case, really not out, they're not in the market to get a degree from, USC. They just need a better job. And what matters is, have I taken good courses that I really kind of bring these skills to the job? And in that world, actually what really matters is the course, not the university. And, Harvard, we luxuriate in the brand of Harvard, right? And everybody comes, they pay unbelievable amounts of money to have that brand right there. And so for a while, that matters up there. But then the problem for Harvard is that at a snapshot in time, that isn't as good as Harvard, and the brand of Harvard is, but if you take it from a dynamic perspective, 15 years down the road, it's not inconceivable to me that people are coming into the market in some fields competing with people from Harvard. And Harvard, because it has an interdependent architecture, Harvard actually can't describe what their students can do. It's odd to say, but we don't have standards, and we will never have standards because we have to negotiate that amongst ourselves, and that will just never happen. But these guys come up and they can say, I took this from the best. Here's the evidence. And it's all, And so I think that it'll happen over time. There's some who, are very rich and can continue to pay for the brand. But it's also inconceivable to me that USC would hold on to that possibility, because if the government's, the hydraulic jacks fail, then it's true that only the rich can afford you guys. 30 or 40 of the faculty who are world class. And we need to have the components, and because in the future, the money will come from having millions of people taking your components. And the fact that USC as a brand here is attached to the university and there is attached to the course, both of them will enhance the brand of the university if you do that right. What would be horrible is if the core has to say, oh, dang, we got to offer a Stanford course. Then you've done it. That's a great question. Yes?
So is this kind of what we're seeing in K through 12 with the birth of online learning, blended learning, charter schools. And although it's free education, is it the demand that's driving the need for these?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just went on too long on this, but the next concept there was that the marriage of online learning and K through 12 is, I'm going to go over 3 minutes if you don't mind. This is another piece of our research around this question of motivation. And motivation in K through 12 is a big problem, right? But it's not unique to K through 12. In healthcare, the fact that overweight people have type 2 diabetes is a horrific problem. How do we motivate them to lose weight? You know, and in every company, every time you're trying to get somebody to buy the product, the problem is how do we motivate them to buy the product? So motivation is a generic problem. And the causal mechanism, in other words, what causes Clay Christensen to buy this product or enroll in that course or lose weight is I have a job that I got to get done. And understanding the customer is the wrong unit of analysis. Understanding the job the customer is trying to do is what you really got to understand, because needing to get a job done is the causal mechanism that causes us to go out and pull something into our lives. And so in our piece called Disrupting Class, we tried to figure out what's the job that children are trying to do. And it turns out that school isn't a job. School is something that they could hire to get the job done, but that's not the job. The job is every day the students need to feel successful. That's the job. And sure, I could hire school, but I could also drop out of school and join a gang to feel successful. Or I could buy a car and cruise around the neighborhood all day to feel successful. But when you look at it on that basis, where the job is, I need to feel successful, most of our schools are organized not to help the students feel successful on a day-to-day basis, you know. And anyway, so there's, I think, some good stuff that we have done. But what it means is that if you can transform the delivery of content to online learning, then the teacher can spend her time as a tutor to the students, but even more importantly, to design projects where they have to master the material in order to collectively complete a really complicated job. And that allows them every day to go home feeling that they're being successful. And so online learning, what the low end means is, of all of the value-adding activity that a teacher can bring to the classroom, to me the low end is the delivery of the content. If I can pass that off to online, then the higher level skills are in tutoring and putting together really engaging courses or projects that cause them to understand deeply the content so that they can solve this. And so it's like we enable the teachers to go up market. It is absolutely not that we want to obsolete the teacher. It just allows them to do so that the school does what the job is. That's a great question, long answer, I'm sorry. Thanks for letting me do this with you guys.